So what does the American dream mean to you?
So I'm the child of immigrants. My parents came from Taiwan. They actually went to Taiwan during the war from China, so they were kind of chased out of China during the conflict between the Japanese and the Chinese. So for my dad's side of the family, he lost everything. His family actually got split up when they were trying to flee from all the war and the communists and that whole conflict. But my mom, her family actually remained relatively intact in Taiwan, so they actually did pretty well. My grandfather on my mom's side was a professor at the university, and so they did pretty well. But for both of them, they wanted to leave Taiwan to kind of expand their opportunities. For my mom, it meant getting a graduate degree. Actually, I'm pretty proud of her because we found out after she passed that she was the first Chinese American woman to graduate with a master's in chemistry from the University of Illinois. Yeah, we didn't know that until she had passed, and we did some research. And anyways, we created a scholarship in her name for other Asian American women students coming through that program. So she, I think, was unusual in the sense that she became a professional in her field, and she did very well. She, I think, would have gotten even further if she actually hadn't decided to, stay home with her children and create a family. But I know she was happy, doing both. For my dad, it was more of starting from scratch. He actually had very little, and he found his way over to the United States because his brother had come here originally, and he worked like every odd job you can think of. He sold encyclopedias and vacuum cleaners and worked in restaurants and did whatever he could. And then he met my mom, and they started a family and kind of joined like the middle class and raised 3 kids. So for me, thinking about where they came from, I think in both cases it was hard for both of them to start a new life in a different country. They saw the opportunity in the United States where they didn't see it in Taiwan, and they were relatively successful. So I think for me, it's having an opportunity, being able to work hard to get to a place where you feel like you can contribute to society and take care of yourself, and maybe start a family and be able to provide for that family. To me, that seems like the American dream.
Did you think about it growing up for yourself and deciding what you wanted to do?
So that's an interesting question. I think for me and my siblings, the expectation was that we would be successful. It wasn't really a question of whether we would be successful or not. I think I can't speak for my siblings, but I think for me, growing up in a suburb outside of Philadelphia where there were very few people who look like me, it wasn't so much finding a way to succeed. It was more like finding myself along the way. And so I don't think as I was growing up, I ever felt like I wouldn't be successful doing something, but I wasn't sure I fit in American society. Like I knew I had a good education, I had skills, I was, a good reader, I was active in my school. I did all the things everybody else did, so I didn't really think that I wouldn't be successful, but it was more of a question of whether or not I felt like I fit in American society. And I think that's part of the American dream that doesn't get talked about as much. The way I hear it when people talk about the American dream is more about like economic success, finding a job, becoming successful or stable, being able to support yourself. But for me, I think it has a lot to do also with the identity of American, and whether or not I'm accepted by the people around me, and whether or not I feel like I belong wherever I go. So I think for me, finding a place at Milton because when originally I was hired to work with Asian American students because there were no Asian American faculty on campus. And so for me, that was important because I felt like I had a purpose at a school. I mean, I taught at a bunch of different places. I was teaching at the college level when I got here, but I really felt like Milton needed somebody to work with Asian American students and think about their support and success and all of that. So I felt like I had a role to play, which I think for me is a little bit more important than just being successful like having a sense of purpose. So that's kind of how I look at it in my own experience.
I guess kind of building off that, who do you consider American? As you said, like about you trying to find your place in like American society and everything like that. Like how did you see Americans that you thought, you know, fit into society, or how like now has like your vision changed, or has it not changed?
Sure, yeah. So when I was growing up, because there weren't a lot of people in my community that were Asian American, I actually spent a lot of time trying to fit in and to assimilate, and so I tried to do everything else that my friends were doing, like, so my parents sent me to Chinese school for a little while, and I didn't really like it, so I stopped going. But they also sent me to get like swimming lessons and horseback riding lessons and roller skating lessons and violin lessons and piano, you know, but my friends were doing those things too. And they weren't Asian American, they were American. They were white American for the most part. And I felt like that made more sense. Like I wanted to do what everybody else was doing. As I got older and when I went to California for college, where there were actually a lot of Asian Americans, people who looked like me, I realized that I didn't have to be somebody else to be me, that there was such a thing as Asian American. I don't know if I can explain it well, but on the East Coast, because I think the history's a little different, the immigration history is a little different, you don't feel it as much. I think Asian Americans, well, I do, feel more on the outside and on the inside. But if you go to California, like the San Francisco Bay Area, where the history is so long, you know, Asian American history, right, takes you back to the 1850s, and they did everything, and they still continue to do everything. So when you go out there and you look around and you see people who are completely assimilated, but they're not necessarily trying to be other people, they're more just being themselves, and they fit, and you see the history, and you see Asian American poets and musicians and politicians, and you know, they're doing everything, all normal American things, that feels more real to me, or like connected. So there's not that kind of split dichotomy that I feel on the East Coast. So I feel more secure in my American identity when I'm actually on the West Coast. Yeah, I just don't happen to live there anymore.
Do you feel like you found that sense of belonging that you said like you're always kind of looking for when you're growing up, or do you feel yourself still looking to find that like acceptance that is like American?
I think I found it when I was in college, and I read a lot of Asian American history and literature, and I actually started teaching Asian American classes for my peers. I got involved in the Asian American student groups on campus. Like, I really had to create that for myself, and I had friends who were doing it at the same time, so we all kind of did it together. But we were looking, we consciously went off campus when we heard that there was an Asian American speaker somewhere, or a jazz. I have good friends who are jazz musicians, Asian American jazz musicians, and whenever they performed, we'd show up. You know, we were starving for that kind of stuff. So plays and even like protests and things. You know, that was the time we were protesting against apartheid. We were fighting for diversity on campus. You know, anytime there was a reason to meet other Asian Americans, either on or off campus, we took it. So I feel like I created that sense of identity and community there. And so I feel pretty confident and secure in that identity. I felt that way for a long time, I think, ever since I graduated from college. How I see myself now is I'm trying to create that for other people, like kids here at Milton, so they can have that before they go off to college or move to a different part of the country. Yeah.
Do you feel as though you've achieved the American dream?
Yes, I'm pretty sure I have. I think having a stable job and a family, and I've been able to contribute back in different ways, either through my teaching or my writing, that, I think I feel that I have a place in this society and I've been able to contribute, so.
Mm-hmm.
What is your opinion on, there's been some discussion about like the whole idea of referring to groups of people as like hyphenated American, say Asian American or Haitian American. Do you think that like in a way can serve to divide Americans because it calls out differences, or does it bring together groups based on like a similar heritage?
I think it's a matter of timing. What the expectation is. So if we still see American society as a society in which people have to assimilate, then I do think the hyphenation causes conflict because it makes it known, right, that you're not necessarily part of the mainstream. Like there's something about you that you want to distinguish from the mainstream. And so that's how I grew up. In the 80s, it really was about assimilation. Like everything up until the 80s, I think, was about assimilation. It probably varies depending on what part of the country you're in. But the 90s and, the last couple of decades has been more about people living more authentic lives, and especially at schools, right, and colleges, not necessarily throughout the country, but as the country has changed, I think people are understanding that they don't have to assimilate necessarily, because in many ways, when you assimilate as a minority person, you're giving up something, right? You're not necessarily, mainstream society isn't assimilating to you, right? It's you assimilating to mainstream society. So that's always something that requires a giving up of identity in some way. So I understand when the country, when the minority groups are smaller, that's realistic, that's more practical, that makes sense to me, I get that. But I think as the numbers continue to change, especially where states where you know that the minority populations are significant, like it makes no sense for 40% of the population to assimilate. I mean, they're 40% of the population, right? I think the hyphenation, when there's more diversity, shouldn't be as threatening. I don't see it as threatening. I think it's a claiming of identity, and everybody should have an identity to claim. It's up to them. It's all, I believe in self-identifying. I don't think you can force identity on someone, right? They have to come to it themselves. But if everybody's experiencing identity on some level, then I think the hyphenation shouldn't be seen as threatening. It's more like a reclaiming of something that they want to be proud about. Does that make sense? Yeah. I see that, I've seen that happen at Milton, because I've been here for 27 years now. And when I started, the Asian American population, international Asian American population, was about 8%. So it made sense that the expectation would be that they would just assimilate, right? And I know, working with those students, they came to Milton to be part of Milton, right? They wanted the Milton experience. They knew that, their parents knew that, that's why they sent them here. But now you have an Asian American population that's 25% of the school. So that changes things a lot. And I'm not saying that people aren't coming for the Milton experience, but I think the Milton experience looks differently now. And next year I hear that the kids of color will be 50%, or like a little bit more than 50%. That's gonna make things different. Like assimilation doesn't really mean anything at that point. It's not really about assimilation anymore. It's about integration and inclusion, and everybody has their little piece to contribute. So if people want to identify in that situation, I think that it actually helps the process.
Are you proud to be American?
Yep. When I feel most American is when I'm overseas. So when I travel, I know, right, when people travel in Asia, so I actually cannot speak any Chinese. My Chinese skills are very poor. I've tried to take classes and, to pick up what I can. But so when I go to visit family, either in parts of China, Beijing, Shanghai, or in Hong Kong, people know right away I'm not Chinese. Like I can't even pretend to be Chinese. I can't speak the language, right? So I feel really American when I'm in those areas. And I know that I'm proud of it, because I'm looking at, and I've had experiences in these cultures where, there are things that I wouldn't want for my family. Like I wouldn't want parts of those cultures, actually. So for instance, and this is very stereotypical and traditional, but the way women are treated. Okay, in Chinese families, Chinese culture, Chinese society is still pretty backward. I mean, it depends where you are, but I notice it all the time when I travel. And I'm proud of the fact that Americans, have gotten further along in their treatment of women. And I think actually Asian cultures can learn a lot from American society because of that. I'm not so happy with like the hierarchy in Chinese families, you know? I mean, I love my family and I respect the elders in my family, and I value that, and I teach my children to value that, respect their elders. But it's also it can be a very limiting culture in that way, right? When you know, the expectation is to like kind of obey those that are older. There's not a lot of room for engagement and creativity and outside of the box thinking, like, you know, those kinds of things. So when I'm in those areas, those differences really come through, and that's what reminds me that I like being an American. I like the fact that that I was born in the United States, that I grew up here, that I have values that are different. And then at the same time, when I'm here and I have issues with American culture, I can kind of fall back on, well, you know, Chinese Americans, they really take care of their grandparents, you know. So I teach my children that, right? I want them to have that. And I don't necessarily see that in mainstream American society, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like I can pick and choose because I have both experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Would you consider yourself a patriot?
I think most of the time. I remember growing up being very proud of being in the United States. I had a picture of President Reagan on my wall. I mean, I was, you know, in high school, and I was proud to be an American. I remember that. I remembered that distinctly. But as I've grown up and learned more about history, right, American history, became a history teacher. I've learned a lot about, you know, where American values have kind of fell by the wayside during times of conflict, or when there are choices to be made that it's been hard to uphold what I feel are true American values like democracy and justice and equality. So I don't think I'm anti-American. I don't think I've ever been. I think when I was an activist on campus, my parents were worried because it sounded like I was being anti-American by advocating for the rights of others, you know, being critical of, for instance, Stanford's policy on divestment, right? Stanford invested its money in companies that did business in South Africa. And so that was the issue on campus, and I got involved in some of the organizing around trying to get universities like Stanford to get their money out. To try to undermine apartheid. So when my parents learned of my activism, they were really worried that I was coming across to others as being like anti-American or unpatriotic or, like, you know, some kind of radical. But the way I looked at it, the way I understood it, is that's what being an American is, that you try to make it better. That there is this promise in the Constitution, the Declaration, right, that we'll always be better, that the franchise will continue to expand, that's the vision for the country, even though it started out very narrowly, but that there was enough momentum to try to, bring those values to people who weren't necessarily included at different times. So that's kind of how I look at it.